Welcome, weary traveller of time. Tonight, we drift back to ancient Rome, to the reign of one of history's most notorious emperors, Caligula, a man whose whims knew no bounds, whose madness became legend, and whose favorite horse, Incitatus, was said to dine in marble stables where jewel, and even hold the sacred title of priest. A 19th century illustration depicts Emperor Caligula dining with his beloved horse Incitatus, who is draped in fine cloth as if an honored guest. In the stillness of a Roman night nearly 2 millennia ago, lamplight flickers on marble walls and cobbled streets. A gentle hush has fallen over the imperial city, a hush ordered by the emperor himself, all to ensure that one very special resident can enjoy a peaceful night's rest. In a grand marble stall blanketed in royal purple and attended by servants sleeps Incitatus, the favorite horse of Emperor Gaius Julius Caesar, Germanicus, better known as Caligula. This isn't just any horse, he is at the center of one of Rome's most surreal tales. As the moon casts a silvery glow, Caligula's palace stands silent and looming, and one could imagine the young emperor pacing in his chambers, a wry smile on his face, contemplating the audacious joke he's about to play on the Roman elite. In this soothing nocturne of history, we begin the story of Caligula and Incitatus, a story blending fact and legend, set against the backdrop of imperial Rome's splendor and madness. Caligula's footsteps echo softly on the polished floors as he wanders to the stables to visit Incitatus. By day, this stallion thunders around the racetrack, the darling of Rome's chariot racing enthusiasts. By night, he dines, at least in legend, as an honored guest at the emperor's table. Ancient writers tell us Caligula would invite Incitatus to dinner, offering the horse gilded oats and even toasting to his health with goblets of wine. Picture the absurdity: a richly adorned banquet hall, marble pillars glistening in lamplight, where senators in their togas recline on couches. And at the head of one couch stands Incitatus nibbling from an ivory manger as slaves attend him. The emperor, with a deadpan expression, raises a golden cup in salute to his equine companion. This is the atmosphere of our tale, extravagant, a touch whimsical, yet recounted in calm, hushed tones, as if it were a bedtime story from a strange, distant world. In this gentle telling, we will explore how Caligula, a young emperor in his 20s, showered his horse, Incitatus, with honors fit for royalty, and even allegedly considered him for high office. We will wander through the halls of Roman power and the streets of the capital, digressing into the daily life and customs of the time. As listeners, you will find yourself immersed in the sights, sounds, and ironies of ancient Rome. From the roar of the chariot races to the hushed prayers at temples, from the marble grandeur of the imperial palace to the curious gossip whispered in the markets. All the while, our tone will remain soothing and unhurried, a dry, affectionate narration of history's oddities, inviting you to drift deeper into both knowledge and sleep. So nestle into your covers as we set the stage. It is the year AD 40 in Rome. The emperor's lavish parties have ended for the evening. The city's elite have reluctantly complied with Caligula's bizarre command for silence in the neighborhood, so that Incitatus, the horse who hosted tonight's feast, can slumber undisturbed. In the darkness, one might imagine Caligula gently patting Incitatus's neck, whispering goodnight to the drowsy stallion. Outside, the Roman stars shine over the Tiber River. The world's most powerful empire holds its breath, all for the comfort of a horse. And with that surreal image, the curtain rises on our story of Caligula and his extraordinary equine friend, unfolding with a calm and dreamlike cadence. Part 2. The young emperor and his new Rome. Under the soft glow of dawn, as Rome slowly awakens, we turn our attention to Caligula himself, the unlikely protagonist of this historical fable. Born as Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus in 12 AD, he was nicknamed Caligula, meaning little boots, by soldiers who doted on him as a child. By 37 AD, at just 24 years old, this Caligula became Emperor of Rome, inheriting absolute power over millions. In the early days of his reign, Romans rejoiced. Here was a grandson of the beloved Germanicus, and the heir of Emperor Tiberius, stepping forward as a young, energetic ruler. The first months of Caligula's rule were remembered as surprisingly blissful. He freed those unjustly imprisoned, paid bonuses to the Praetorian Guard, and hosted generous games and feasts for the public, winning golden opinions from all. The city bustled with hope that a new golden age might be dawning after the gloomy end of Tiberius's era. But soon, hints of unsettling eccentricity emerged. Ancient writers like Philo and Seneca later noted a dramatic change in Caligula's behavior about 6 months into his reign, possibly after a serious illness in late 37 AD. Some whispered that the fever had left the young emperor mentally unbalanced. Others believed that the limitless power of the emperorship simply revealed the capricious, cruel streak Caligula had hidden before. Either way, the Caligula who recovered was not the same mild, diplomatic prince the Romans initially applauded. He began to indulge strange whims and dark humor, almost as if testing the bounds of what an emperor could get away with. He demanded to be treated not merely as head of state, but as a living god on earth, appearing in public dressed as Apollo or Jupiter. He referred to the full consular magistrates, the highest officials in Rome, in mocking terms, and even had the sun and moon greeted in his name. The line between grand ceremony and satire blurred in the halls of Roman power. To understand the context of Caligula's infamous horse, we must grasp the world of Roman imperial culture he inhabited. Though Rome had an emperor, many old republican institutions still existed, chief among them the consuls and the Senate. Consuls were once the pinnacle of political career in the Republic. In Caligula's time, they were largely honorific. 2 appointed each year, often loyal senators whom the emperor wished to favor. The Senate, a body of noblemen, still convened to advise and ratify the emperor's decisions, though by now it rarely dared oppose the imperial will. Caligula, educated on the island of Capri under the paranoid Tiberius, had learned early how senators could fawn one day and scheme the next. He regarded the Senate with a mix of distrust and scorn. As a young autocrat, Caligula wielded absolute authority, but also craved the dramatic and the novel. He loved theater, gladiatorial games, and above all, chariot racing, with a youthful passion that sometimes startled the staid Roman aristocracy. In this part of our tale, imagine Caligula strolling through the ornate corridors of his palace in the early morning. Marble statues of Jupiter and Mars seem to watch as he passes. The emperor's expression is distant, perhaps contemplating a new spectacle or prank. His purple robes, dyed the deep hue reserved only for the imperial family, trail softly behind him on the mosaic floor. He's heading to the stables once again, where Incitatus, his prize horse, is being groomed for the day's races. On the way, Caligula might pause by a balcony to gaze upon the Roman Forum below, already coming alive with vendors and petitioners. One can almost hear him chuckle under his breath, recalling some absurdity from last night's banquet. After all, who else but Caligula would hold a lavish party in a stable or think to toy with the sacred office of consul? Caligula's sense of humor was dry and dangerous. For instance, when the consuls once forgot to announce his birthday, Caligula reacted by deposing them on the spot and leaving Rome without its chief magistrates for several days. On another occasion, he burst into sudden laughter at a formal dinner. When his alarmed consular guests politely inquired what amused him, Caligula coolly remarked that with a single gesture he could have both their throats cut, then resumed dining as if nothing had happened. Such anecdotes, passed down by the biographer Suetonius and others, paint a picture of an emperor who enjoyed the shock value of his absolute power. He was a young man testing the limits of what Rome's deeply rooted traditions could bear. Yet in the soft telling of our story, we must note that not all is reliably recorded fact. Much comes from gossip and later historians who relished a sensational tale. As we proceed, we'll keep a gentle foot in both worlds, the documented history and the likely embellishments that turned Caligula into a legend of madness. By understanding the stage of the political structure of Rome, the emperor's newfound divine pretensions, and the uneasy cohabitation of emperor and senate, we set the scene for the entrance of Incitatus into history's spotlight. Soon the horse's marble stable and silk cushions will seem only fitting as Caligula's whimsy spirals into one of the most famous anecdotes of the ancient world. But before that, let's slow our pace and visit the racecourse where the bond between Caligula and his steed was truly forged. Part 3, Chariots, Crowds, and the Beloved Horse. Morning light spills over the Circus Maximus, Rome's enormous chariot racing stadium. In this gentle dawn, we imagine the grounds empty and quiet, a stark contrast to the roaring crowds that will fill it by noon. Caligula's footsteps are light as he inspects the track, breathing in the scent of damp sand and lingering incense from yesterday's games. This hippodrome is the young emperor's playground and sanctuary. Here, away from Senate debates and imperial decrees, Caligula is simply a passionate fan, even participant of Rome's favorite sport, chariot racing. Caligula adored the green racing faction, one of the teams fiercely supported by Roman fans, and his allegiance was wholehearted. In fact, he was so enamored with the stables that he reportedly spent nights in the barracks of the green team's horses, carousing with the charioteers as if they were old friends. The aristocrats of Rome found this highly unorthodox, an emperor letting down his guard to revel in the company of jockeys and stable hands. But it endeared Caligula to the common people. One can almost picture the sleepy-eyed charioteers sharing watered wine with the ruler of the known world, trying not to show their awe as Caligula, perhaps slightly tipsy, jokes with them about the day's race outcomes. At the center of this racing world was Incitatus, whose name in Latin means swift or at full gallop. A tall, muscular stallion of high pedigree, Incitatus was Caligula's pride. The emperor personally drove Incitatus in some races, a shocking spectacle, since Roman elites considered it beneath an emperor's dignity to perform as a common charioteer. But Caligula either didn't care or enjoyed flouting the norm. Dressed in gleaming racing armor, reins in hand, he raced his beloved horse around the track to the delirious cheers of the urban masses. It was said that when Caligula the charioteer won, the crowd erupted with an enthusiasm that perhaps even the gladiatorial games could not match. This personal involvement in the sport only deepened Caligula's bond with Incitatus, not merely as a pet, but almost as a comrade in arms on the track. On race days, Incitatus became a celebrity in his own right. Romans loved spectacle, and the emperor's horse enjoyed an almost cult status. The night before a big race, Caligula took extraordinary measures to ensure Incitatus was calm and well-rested. He stationed soldiers around the horse's stable with orders to enforce absolute silence in the neighborhood. Imagine the scene in a normally noisy city. No barking dogs, no clatter of carts, no late-night revelers. A whole block of Rome kept quiet under threat of imperial anger, just so a racehorse could sleep. Such was Caligula's dedication to Incitatus's performance. It was as if a tender-hearted friend wanted nothing to disturb his companionless sweet dreams before a big day. The surreal humor of an emperor deploying military discipline for a horse's comfort would not have been lost on those who heard of it. In our own calm narration, it draws a slight smile, the emperor of the world acting as dutiful servant to a stallion. As the sun rises higher, vendors start setting up stalls around the Circus Maximus, preparing to sell honeyed nuts, wine, and meat pies to the coming throngs. In the stables, Incitatus is being groomed to a shine. A purple mantle, the imperial color, is laid across the horse S-back for the pre-race procession. Some say Incitatus even had a collar studded with precious gems, so that when he trotted out, the morning sun would catch the jewels and announce the horse's presence with a dazzling sparkle. Caligula arrives to personally feed him a handful of the finest oats mixed with flakes of gold, a luxurious treat noted by the historian Cassius Dio. While this might sound implausible, it was recorded in earnest. The emperor's favorite horse dined literally on riches. True or exaggerated, the image persists. Gold-flecked oats for a horse that would outshine all others on the track that day. In these moments, Caligula seems less the deranged tyrant of later law and more a young man utterly besotted with his hobby. Many Romans of wealth pampered their racehorses and celebrated their victories, though none on such a scale. The difference was that Caligula, as emperor, had the resources of an empire to lavish upon his equine friend, where another enthusiast might merely brush his horse and pray for good fortune. Caligula could erect marble statues in Incitatus' honor, or declare a public holiday if Incitatus won a particularly important race, and indeed, there were rumors he did just that. The dry humor in this, which we savor quietly, is how an emperor's personal quirks become national events. If Caligula was in a jovial mood because Incitatus won, the whole of Rome might feast. If a rival charioteer's team beat Incitatus, Caligula's dark cloud could mean a day of terse orders at the palace. By midday, the circus is roaring. But in our soft retelling, we do not amplify those roars. We merely note them in the background, like distant thunder heard from a safe, cozy room. The ground trembles as chariots speed by in a blur. The green faction supporters scream Caligula's name, and Incitatus's too, while the rival blue faction's fans gnash their teeth. Dust swirls in golden sunlight. Amid this excitement, Caligula's face is alight with childlike glee. He watches Incitatus surge forward, and perhaps he feels that in honoring this horse, he is sharing his joy with the gods. Victory or loss today matters less for our story. What is important is how deeply this emperor's identity and happiness became entangled with a horse. It set the stage for an audacious idea that would soon germinate in Caligula's mind, one that would scandalize Rome's high society and secure his place in history's eccentric Hall of Fame. Part 4. Luxury in the Stables. Incitatus lives like a lord. As twilight falls on race day and the din of the Circus Maximus fades into memory, we follow Caligula and Incitatus back to more intimate surroundings. The setting sun casts long shadows across the marble stable that Caligula built for his cherished steed. This is no ordinary barn. It is a miniature palace for a horse, an architectural testament to the emperor's indulgence and humor. Let us step inside this stable, our footsteps echoing on polished marble. The air is perfumed with the scent of fresh hay, mingled with imported frankincense. Yes, Caligula even perfumed his horse's stable, if we believe the ancient jests. By the door, a guard stands ever vigilant, as if protecting a noble dignitary. Within, oil lamps flicker golden light on a scene of almost absurd opulence. Incitatus's stall is lined with gleaming white marble panels, cool to the touch, which keep the interior pleasant even in Rome's summer heat. Instead of a rough trough, Incitatus eats from an ivory manger, carved and polished, a feeding box fit for an animal in Jupiter's own stables. Silken tapestries, perhaps gifts from Eastern kings seeking Caligula's favor, hang on the walls to muffle sound and add an exotic touch of color. And there, draped over a rail, are rich blankets dyed in Tyrian purple, the same expensive dye reserved for emperors and kings, which serve as Incitatus as horse blankets. One can imagine a bemused stable hand carefully laying one over the horse on a cool evening, the deep purple cloth contrasting against Incitatus's coat. Next to the stall stands a large chest or cupboard, and inside it, if rumors held true, was a wardrobe of sorts. For Incitatus had a wardrobe of fine accessories, collars adorned with gemstones, harnesses inlaid with gold, and studded with pearls, and even a sort of necklace or garland that matched the jewelry Caligula himself wore at festivals. Every detail of Incitatus's care was supervised. The horse even had his own team of 18 servants at one point, if we trust the later chroniclers, grooms, feeders, and caretakers, whose sole job was to see that the emperor's four-legged friend never wanted for anything. Caligula didn't stop at material comforts. He extended social privileges to Incitatus as well. The horse had a house with a garden adjacent to the stable, according to Suetonius, and Caligula would send formal invitations in the horse's name to honored guests. We pause to absorb this quietly comedic scenario. A Roman senator of ancient lineage receiving a written invitation to dine at the house of Incitatus, the horse, and feeling obligated to attend out of fear or politeness. At these unique dinner parties, Incitatus, brushed to a shine, and perhaps wearing an elegant ribbon, would be the host. Guests were said to be entertained in the horse's name, with slaves on hand to offer them wine and delicacies. The horse himself might stand by, munching his golden grain, while Caligula acted as a translator of sorts. Incitatus invites you to enjoy the feast, he might say, with a playful glint in his eye, raising a toast to his horse's good health. Suetonius tells us that Caligula gave Incitatus a house, a troop of slaves and furniture, for the more elegant entertainment of guests invited in his name. It is a dry, matter-of-fact statement in the ancient text, yet one that never fails to prompt a chuckle at the sheer absurdity of it. Imagine being a fly on the wall at one of these suppers. The clink of silver plates, low murmurs of senators attempting small talk, perhaps praising the horse's beauty or racing skill as if he could understand, Caligula sitting serenely while patting Incitatus's neck. A consul, perhaps already uneasy that a horse might soon join his ranks, forces a polite smile as a slave fills his goblet. The atmosphere is both lavish and ludicrous, a satire come to life. And that is precisely how many modern historians interpret these events. Caligula was engaging in an elaborate prank at the expense of Rome's aristocracy. By elevating a horse to such heights, he subtly suggested that the highest honors of the state had become meaningless baubles in his hands. Even a beast could potentially wear them. We should note in our calming narrative tone that to the Romans, this scene carried multiple layers of meaning. On one hand, animals were often part of Roman daily life. Wealthy homes had pets, and impressive beasts were sometimes displayed in triumphs and public games. But to treat an animal as a human equal or better, that crossed into the realm of satire or even sacrilege. Roman religion held certain animals sacred, eagles for Jupiter, peacocks for Juno, etc., but those creatures weren't given human titles or offices. Caligula's contemporaries would recall, for instance, that the Emperor Augustus, Caligula's great-grandfather-in-law, had once gently scolded a subordinate for calling him Lord Augustus preferred modesty and pretending to be just the first among equals. Now here was Caligula turning that tradition on its head by granting a horse more luxuries and attention than many senators could ever dream of. Yet within the walls of Incitatus's marble stable, one finds an odd serenity in our tale. The horse, of course, was blissfully unaware of the commotion he caused. Incitatus likely enjoyed the pampering, the soft bedding, no expense spared there either, perhaps straw imported from the finest Spanish farms, the massages and brushing from his many grooms, the occasional treat of wine offered in a golden bowl. Yes, Cassius Dio notes that Caligula would drink to Incitatus' health in wine from golden goblets and share the wine with the horse. One imagines Incitatus lapping at the rich liquid, while Caligula, cup in hand, declares solemnly, "To Incitatus, long may he enjoy good fortune." Such scenes, if they truly occurred, would have been recounted in Rome with incredulous laughter or whispered dismay. Here in Part 4 we linger in the comfortable absurdity of Incitatus's daily life. Outside, the Roman night deepens. A soft breeze drifts through the colonnade of the stable's entrance, carrying distant music from another of Caligula's banquets in the palace. Incitatus, well-fed and perhaps a little drowsy from a sip of wine, stomps a hoof contentedly on his marble floor. Caligula himself might be leaning against a pillar, quietly talking to his horse or talking to himself about plans yet to come. The servants dare not disturb their emperor's private moment. In this lull, we can almost hear Caligula's low voice. "They call us mad, my friend," he might whisper, running his fingers through Incitatus's mane, "but soon you'll show them how wise we really are." The stage is set for Caligula's next astonishing move, a jest so extravagant it would echo through history and solidify his infamy. Part 5. The Consulship Prank. Senator Incitatus. One morning, not long after one of Incitatus's racing victories, a strange rumor began circulating through Rome's marketplaces and bathhouses. In hushed tones, for who would dare speak too loudly of the emperor's intentions, people whispered that Caligula planned to make his horse a consul. The consulship, as we've noted, was the highest office of the old republic, still imbued with dignity. Was it possible? Could the emperor truly mean to appoint a horse to the Roman Senate's most senior magistracy? Let's unfold this step by step, calmly and with gentle amusement. Caligula by now had shown a flair for symbolic gestures that walked the line between joke and decree. Some modern scholars argue that the idea of Incitatus as consul likely began as an offhand remark at one of Caligula's dinner parties. Picture the scene, Caligula lounging with a cup of wine, Incitatus's velvet nose poking over his shoulder. A senator, emboldened by drink, perhaps makes a snide comment about the competence of recent consuls. Caligula smirks and says, "My dear Incitatus could do a better job than those asses." Laughter around the table, some genuine, some forced. The emperor goes on, eyes glittering. "In fact, I think I'll make him consul next year." Gasps, then a nervous chuckle when they realize Caligula is joking? Or is he? According to the biographer Suetonius, it was also reported that Caligula designated Incitatus for the consulship, which implies the plan was spoken of, though never carried out. Meanwhile, the historian Cassius Dio, writing a century later, adds even more flourish. Caligula promised to appoint him consul, and would certainly have done so if he had lived longer. We can almost hear Dio's pen scratching that sentence with a mix of disbelief and relish. By the time he wrote, the story had grown into a legend of imperial madness. But within the context of Caligula's reign, many believe this was in fact a calculated mockery. The phrase consul incitatus was Caligula's way of thumbing his nose at the Senate. After all, if the emperor could elevate even a horse to high office, What did that say about the worth of Rome's governing class? We pause to gently explain the pun that may lie at the heart of this scheme. In Latin, one insult for a foolish person was to call them an ass, a donkey. Caligula evidently thought the consuls of his time were doing a poor job, and he quipped that they were such asses he might as well replace them with a horse. In a clever twist noted by a modern historian, David Woods, the name Incitatus, swift or at full gallop, might have been a jab at a particular consul named Asinius Caesar, whose name translates to swift donkey. Asinius comes from Asinus, donkey, and Caesar means swift. So if Caligula said, Incitatus will be consul, it could be a pointed joke, a swift horse, to outdo a swift ass in the consul's chair. We cannot know for sure if Asinius Caesar was indeed a consul around then, or the target, but the timing and wordplay align tantalizingly. It's a subtle humor one Caligula likely delivered with a straight face, leaving his listeners to decide whether to laugh or tremble. How close did Incitatus actually come to holding office? Ancient sources remain clear on one point. The horse never actually entered the Senate or assumed the consulship. There was never a day when Incitatus was formally proclaimed consul of Rome that remained in the realm of intention or expectation. However, some later accounts, and certainly popular imagination, treated it as if it had happened, which is why even today one hears the phrase, Caligula made his horse a consul, as a byword for absurd leadership. What probably occurred is that Caligula, enjoying the discomfort his talk caused, continued to tease the idea over time. Perhaps he let slip in public, next consul, Incitatus, causing courtiers to exchange anxious glances. Maybe he had a new senatorial toga custom-made in horse-friendly proportions, as rumor suggests, so that the day Incitatus assumed office, he'd be properly attired in purple-trimmed robes. It's said that he even had a set of ivory chairs, the curule seats, readied for Incitatus, one for the Senate meetings and one for official ceremonies. Again, these details might be exaggerations, but they paint the picture of a ruler gleefully crossing boundaries. Now imagine the reactions. In the taverns and at the city gates, the common people likely found it hilarious. "All hail Consul Incitatus," a fruit seller might joke, to the chuckles of his customers, secretly pleased to see the high and mighty Senate being taken down a peg. The senators themselves, though, would have been mortified. These were men from Rome's oldest families who had spent decades climbing the cursus honorum, the ladder of public offices. To have their pinnacle of achievement, the consulship, dangled as a toy in front of a horse, it was an insult almost beyond endurance. But what could they do? To protest would be to question the emperor's judgment, possibly inviting deadly suspicion of disloyalty. So they sat, one imagines, in stiff silence during Senate sessions, stealing glances at Caligula, wondering if today he might actually walk in leading Incitatus by the bridle to take up a seat among them. Caligula, for his part, seemed to delight in keeping everyone guessing. Suetonius notes with dry understatement that this consulship plan was mentioned at the climax of Incitatus's pampering description, as if all the marble, ivory, and purple were leading up to this punchline. And in truth, the way the story is often told by ancient writers does give it a punchline quality, as if they too recognize the comedic arc. First you list the outrageous gifts, marble stable, ivory manger, servants, banquet invitations. Then you deliver the topper. And he even intended to make the horse consul. It's written almost with a wink. In our soft narrative, we recount this not to ridicule, but to reflect on the layers of meaning. It was satire as much as insanity. Modern historians caution us that the sources, like Suetonius and Dio, wrote about Caligula years after his death, often under emperors who benefited from portraying the early Julio-Claudian emperors as tyrants or fools. So, did Caligula truly lose his mind to the point of earnestly wanting a horse in the Senate? Or did he craft a provocative piece of political theatre to highlight the obsequiousness and ineptitude he saw in Rome's ruling class? Many lean toward the latter, an elaborate joke that Roman writers with a taste for scandal passed on as literal truth. As one scholar, Anthony Barrett, suggests, stories about Incitatus likely originated from Caligula's own humorous quips. Caligula, with a perverse sense of humor, perhaps loved to imagine the flustered faces of senators whenever Incitatus's political career was mentioned. Yet in the spirit of a bedtime chronicle, we let the listener decide the tone. Is this a comedy of power or the tragedy of a disturbed mind? Perhaps it is a bit of both. For now, the image we hold is a gentle one. Incitatus, draped in senatorial purple, nodding serenely as Caligula announces him as consul designate, while around them the Senate hall is silent, except for the shuffling of stunned old men. It's an image from a dream, almost too fantastical for reality, which is exactly why it has survived as an anecdote for almost 2,000 years. Part 6, Gods and Beasts, a Horse in the Temple. As the tale of the consul horse spread, Caligula did not stop at political provocation. In the next act of his surreal reign, he entwined Incitatus with the divine realm as well. By now, Caligula had unabashedly embraced being treated as a living god, a notion that unnerved Romans, who traditionally only deified emperors after death. He built lavish temples for his own worship and installed a colossal statue of himself in the temple of Jupiter. Priests of his cult had to make costly sacrifices to honor divine Gaius. It's within this atmosphere of half-sincerity, half-mockery that we find Incitatus receiving a religious honor. The horse was reportedly made a priest in the cult of Caligula himself. What did it mean to make a horse a priest? In practical terms, of course, Incitatus would not lead prayers or perform sacrifices. Those duties would fall to the handlers and priests around him. But symbolically, Caligula appointed Incitatus as a fellow priest to serve his own deified self, effectively enrolling the horse among the sacerdotes who carried out the emperor's cult rituals. Each day in Rome, at altars dedicated to Caligula's genius, divine spirit, priests would sacrifice dainty and expensive birds, peacocks, flamingos, perhaps, in honor of the emperor. It was said that Incitatus's name was included in the prayers, and as a priest, he too was entitled to offerings. We can imagine the comical solemnity. A procession of white-robed priests, human ones, filing into Caligula's private temple, leading Incitatus with them draped in ceremonial ribbons. The altar smoke rises as exotic birds are offered. Incitatus, perhaps attracted by the smell, snorts and stamps. For the well-being of Gaius Caesar and priest Incitatus, the chief priest intones, as those around struggle to keep a straight face. To the Roman elite, this was yet another affront, but also an insight into Caligula's mindset. If making Incitatus a consul was a jibe at the state, making him a priest was a jibe at religion and sanctity. It implied that Caligula's elevation of himself to godlike status was so unquestionable that even a horse could share in the priestly dignity. It also fed into the aura of the emperor's alleged madness. Ancient commentators like to emphasize how out of touch Caligula was to think these things appropriate. Yet, consider, earlier emperors had done subtler versions of such things. Even Augustus had allowed the formation of priestly cults in his and his family's name, though not involving animals. Caligula's twist was simply to do it outrageously. Our narrative, staying mild in tone, observes how Roman religion was flexible, yet traditional. They were no strangers to animals in ritual. Bulls, sheep, and pigs were routinely sacrificed, and augurs watched the behavior of sacred chickens for omens. Some gods even had animal forms or companions. The goddess Diana had her stag, for instance. However, making an animal effectively a member of the religious hierarchy was unheard of. It is small wonder that later generations liked to overlook this priestly detail in favor of the consul's story. Even for them, it was easier to conceive of a horse in politics than a horse in the temple. The conversation of history largely remembers the political angle, power abuse, over the religious one. But Cassius Dio did record the priesthood, albeit tucked in a passage about Caligula's self-deification, almost as a side note amid greater blasphemies. Let's set a serene scene of how this might have looked. The location: Caligula's new temple on the Palatine Hill, constructed so the emperor could have a shrine literally attached to his palace. Within the temple stands a golden statue of Caligula. At its feet, incense burns and flower garlands hang. Incitatus is led in by golden halter and stands beside an altar carved with images of Caligula's family gods. A few tame doves coo in the rafters. Caligula was known to have contrived special effects like mimicking thunder, using machinery to create thunderclaps answering Jupiter's, as Dio recounts. But perhaps for this gentle envisioning, we skip the theatrics. In the quiet of incense and flickering flames, a priest holds out a bowl of water for Incitatus to sip, a part of the ritual libation. The horse, being a horse, probably just thinks it's thirsty and drinks. Caligula, watching, smiles as if something profound has happened. His beloved companion is now not only above senators, but among the divine servants. It is all deeply surreal, yet delivered by our narrator in a matter-of-fact lullaby tone. These were the days when a man's vanity and jest led him to blur the line between gods, men, and beasts. Such is the almost mythic quality of Caligula's story. Indeed, later, Roman writers sometimes compared Caligula to stories of hubris in myth, like King Xerxes whipping the sea or King Midas with his golden touch. Caligula has become a character larger than life, and Incitatus, along with him, trotting through the realm of legend. Interestingly, even as a supposed priest, Incitatus likely continued his normal life, racing, eating, sleeping, oblivious to titles conferred upon him. Caligula might have even joked that Incitatus was a more dutiful priest than others, since a horse cannot sin or plot treachery. In a letter to the Senate, perhaps never sent, but we imagine it, could Caligula have written, "Incitatus, being pure of heart and mind, serves as priest without bias or greed. Would that all my priests were so." Such an implication would sting, as many real priests and officials were corrupt or self-serving. Here again, the dry humor emerges. A horse is incorruptible and guileless, unlike you sly humans, Caligula might imply. In the soft closing of this section, we see how Incitatus, unwittingly, became a mirror Caligula held up to Roman society. By elevating a creature of pure instinct to high offices, Caligula highlighted the corruption, vanity, and absurdity he perceived in those offices. Or perhaps he simply amused himself to relieve boredom or to shock. Whatever his motive, the image stands a horse occupying a place in the sacred order of Rome. And as our story drifts onward, we prepare to leave the realm of active events and step into reflection. How did people react, recount, and remember this bizarre chapter in Romans history? For in the end, Caligula's own story would be cut short, and it would fall to others to interpret what on earth, or what in the gods, had happened in those tumultuous 4 years of his reign. Part 7. Whispers and Repercussions. The aftermath of the joke. It's the winter of 41 AD, and a chill wind blows through Rome's forums. Caligula's antics, from the horse consul plan to declaring himself a god, have pushed many in the Senate and the Praetorian Guard to their breaking point. In a quiet corridor of the palace, a conspiracy is brewing. We, however, observe it from a high vantage, describing the scene in muted tones. A few senators and officers huddled together, their faces tense. Cassius Chaerea, a stern-faced tribune, whom Caligula had insulted one too many times, often calling him effeminate names in public, tightens his jaw as final plans are made. They will strike during a theatrical festival, catching Caligula unarmed. The city sleeps unaware that by tomorrow the chapter of Caligula and Incitatus's privileged life will close violently. We tread carefully here, for the end of Caligula's life is bloody, but our purpose is not to jar the listener. So we recount it as one might relay a distant historical fact. Caligula was assassinated on January 24th, 40 West AD, stabbed by his own guards in a secluded hallway after a performance. The emperor, who thought himself invincible, a living Jupiter, fell to mortal blades. He was 28 years old. As he lay dying, no doubt confusion and perhaps a twisted sense of betrayal flooded his fading consciousness. His wife Caesonia and little daughter were also killed in the aftermath, brutally ensuring no seed of the monster survived. In those frantic hours, what of Incitatus? The sources do not describe this, but one can imagine in the stables. The horse perked up his ears at the distant sounds of shouting, running, the clashing of swords. Perhaps a loyal groom came and led Incitatus away to safety amid the chaos, or perhaps the horse remained in his marble stall, awaiting a dinner that would never come. When the dust settled, Caligula's uncle Claudius was proclaimed the new emperor. Found cowering behind a curtain in fear for his own life, then thrust onto the throne by Praetorian guards who thought him a safe choice. Claudius was a very different man, bookish, awkward, and far more traditional. One of his first acts was to restore order and normalcy. The new regime would have no interest in continuing the farcical elevation of a horse. While details are scant, we are told that Claudius rescinded any honors bestowed upon Incitatus. The horse's public funding, yes, Caligula had apparently assigned Incitatus a salary, or grain dole, like a true magistrate, was cut off. If Incitatus was listed as a member of any priestly college or as consul designate for the coming year, his name was quietly removed. The senator horse was gently put out to pasture, figuratively speaking. One late and likely apocryphal account, stemming from Robert Graves' imaginative historical novel, I, Claudius, which itself drew on obscure legends, claims that Incitatus met a sad end, that he was taken to the racetrack once more, injured his leg, and was thereafter euthanized by having his throat slit, as was the custom for gravely hurt animals. The same tale says his mate, a mare named Penelope, was sent off to Britain to serve in Claudius's invasion forces, a final mundane fate for the line of Caligula's horse. However, these colorful details come from historical fiction and later storytelling rather than authoritative ancient sources. In truth, history's pages go relatively quiet about Incitatus after Caligula's fall. What we do know is the legacy of the story continued to gallop through the ages. Suetonius, writing 80 years later in Hadrian's time, made sure to include the consul horse anecdote in the 12 Caesars, cementing Caligula's image as the emperor who tried to crown a stallion. Cassius Dio, about a century after Suetonius, also relayed it with perhaps even more dramatic flair. Both authors likely had an agenda to illustrate the depths of imperial hubris and folly. And what better symbol than a horse in the Senate? Over time, the nuance that it may have been a jibe, a planned but not executed joke, was lost on many readers. The tale morphed into a shorthand for insane tyranny. In the centuries that followed, whenever a king or leader was deemed ridiculously unfit or an appointment laughably inappropriate, critics would invoke Caligula's horse. The ancient satirist Juvenal might have been alluding to it when he quipped about the degeneration of Rome. Later on, in the 18th century, an English writer in the London Magazine wrote a satirical piece imagining Incitatus as Prime Minister, and cheekily suggesting that this horse was wiser and more honest than Sir Robert Walpole, the actual Prime Minister, implying Walpole was the greater ass. We see how the story left the history books and entered political discourse as an allegory. Even the American founding era references it. In 1776, an essay, The Rights of Great Britain Asserted, cited Incitatus's consulship as a cautionary tale of misrule and the corruption of Roman democracy. Across cultures and eras, the image of the Roman emperor, who made his horse a high official, proved irresistible. In our calm recounting of repercussions, we highlight an interesting transformation. Incitatus became a symbol. No longer just Caligula's cherished pet, he stood for political absurdity, for the folly of unchecked power, and sometimes for the idea that animals might be more honest than humans in positions of trust. The Oxford Dictionary of Phrase and Fable even has an entry for Incitatus, coolly defining him as Caligula's horse, made a consul by the emperor. The truth that he never actually took office is a footnote often skipped. What matters is the enduring lesson or joke. In a more reflective mood, some have also used the story to question, was Caligula truly mad, or did his contemporaries fail to get the joke? Perhaps a bit of both. Ancient commentators like Philo of Alexandria, who lived through Caligula's reign, described him as volatile, cruel, and capricious, a man who could one day spare a foe out of whim and next day execute an ally out of paranoia. The mental instability argument holds that the immense pressures of absolute rule at a young age, combined with possible illness, unhinged Caligula's mind. Thus the horse story becomes a literal example of insanity, a delusional act by a man who lost grip on reality. This view, dramatic as it is, helped Romans after Caligula's death rationalize his reign as an aberration, a nightmare from which the empire woke up. But as we have seen, there is an alternative interpretation supported by scholarly analysis. Caligula was perhaps too witty for his own good, using satirical tyranny to expose the sycophancy around him. As one modern article aptly put it, a joke by Caligula the comedian has been interpreted as historical fact. It is quite possible that had Caligula reigned longer, he might have ultimately pulled back on making Incitatus consul, or conversely, he might have actually done it just to watch the spectacle of senators debating serious matters next to a neighing horse. We'll never know because his life was cut short before this dark comedy reached its final act. And so, the immediate aftermath of Incitatus's meteoric rise was a quiet fading into ordinary horse-dom. One imagines the creature living out his days in a stable under Claudius's watch, no more jeweled collars or exotic banquets, just a fine horse given good care, occasionally visited perhaps by those who remembered with a chuckle that once he was almost one of the rulers of Rome. In one of history's little ironies, Incitatus likely outlived Caligula. Perhaps in a farm outside the city, grazing peacefully, he lived to a decent equine age, unaware that his name would be remembered far longer than any triumph he won on the racetrack. Part 8. The Sources, Suetonius, Seneca, and the Truth. Behind the tale, let us now gently turn our attention to the storytellers who have passed down this tale of Caligula and Incitatus. Our understanding of these events comes mainly from a few ancient authors, each writing with their own style and bias. It's as if we have been listening to a chorus where each voice adds a different tone. And now we meet the chorus members, Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus, Cassius Dio, and a few others like Seneca and Philo, who provide side comments on Caligula's character. Understanding them helps illuminate how the legend of the consul horse took shape. Suetonius, a scholar and imperial secretary in the early 2nd century AD, wrote The 12 Caesars, a set of biographies from Julius Caesar through Domitian. Suetonius loved scandalous anecdotes and juicy details. He was less concerned with strict chronology or political analysis than with painting a vivid character portrait. By the time he wrote about Caligula nearly 80 years after the fact, he had access to imperial archives and probably eyewitness accounts, now lost, and earlier histories. He clearly relished the opportunity to catalogue Caligula's every grotesque or absurd behavior. His account of Incitatus is succinct but striking. He lists the lavish gifts and privileges given to the horse: marble stall, ivory manger, purple, blankets, slaves, and then delivers the famous line that Caligula even planned to make him consul. Suetonius offers no further commentary or explanation there. He doesn't need to. The mere statement is left to stun the reader. We can almost hear Suetonius's dry voice, perhaps with a faint smirk, as he moves on to the next outrageous episode. He's effectively saying, if you thought that was bizarre, listen to this. For Suetonius, these anecdotes serve a moralizing purpose. They illustrate how power and impiety led Caligula to monstrous ends. Yet Suetonius also gathered some details that hint he knew the difference between rumor and reality. Notably, he phrases the consul plan as something it is also said, Latin traditur, implying he's passing along a report, not necessarily sworn fact. This subtle phrasing indicates a tiny scholarly caution, but in the flood of shocking tidbits, it's easy to miss. The bedtime historian in US notes, Suetonius was a bit of a gossip columnist of his day, albeit a learned one. He likely saw the humor, but also the propaganda value. By including Incitatus, he burnished the narrative of Caligula as a deranged tyrant. Cassius Dio, a Roman statesman writing over 150 years after Caligula, penned a huge history of Rome. By Dio's time, many records were lost or fragmentary. He probably relied on accounts like Suetonius's, maybe some senatorial memoirs and oral traditions. Dio's telling is more theatrical. He writes, in the surviving epitome of his work, that Caligula used to invite Incitatus to dinner and offer him golden barley and wine in golden goblets, swearing oaths by the horse's life, and then that he promised to make him consul, and would have done so if he hadn't been killed. Dio even adds context like, he was always greatly attached to the Green faction, and had a place called the Gaianum built for chariot practice. This extra detail on the racing obsession buttresses the plausibility of the Incitatus story. It's like Dio saying, see, he was so horse-crazy, this consul idea fits right in. Dio's tone can be detected as somewhat censorious, but also a tad bemused. Unlike Suetonius, who listed facts, Dio sometimes tries to explain them, e.g., implying had Caligula not been assassinated, the consul horse joke might have become reality. Dio also is our source for the priest detail, which suggests he had a fuller narrative of Caligula's self-deification campaign, and Incitatus's part in it, perhaps drawn from official records or earlier historians like Cluvius Rufus, a contemporary of Caligula whose works are lost except through quotations. There's also Seneca the Younger, philosopher and playwright, who was an adult contemporary of Caligula and later tutor to Nero. Seneca makes a couple of barbed references to Caligula's antics in his essays. In On Mercy, he snidely remarks how absolute power can corrupt judgment, though he doesn't explicitly mention the horse. In another work, he comments on the futility of seeking high office by alluding, perhaps metaphorically, that under cruel emperors even dumb animals might attain rank. If indeed he had Incitatus in mind, it shows the tale had currency among Rome's intellectual circles soon after Caligula's death. However, Seneca had to be careful. Writing under Caligula's successors, he could not openly ridicule an emperor, even a dead one, without risking offense to the new regime if they took it as criticism by proxy. So any allusion is oblique. Philo. Of Alexandria and Flavius Josephus, two Jewish writers who described Caligula's reign, especially regarding his conflicts with the Jews, do not mention the horse at all. Philo, who met Caligula in person during an embassy, paints him as unhinged and self-absorbed, recounting episodes like Caligula installing a statue of himself in the Jerusalem temple, a huge sacrilege to the Jews, but nothing about Incitatus. Josephus, writing later, similarly focuses on Caligula's impieties and assassination, but leaves out the horse. This silence from some contemporaries suggests that to those outside Rome, the Incitatus affair was not as significant or was possibly seen as just a silly rumor not worth mentioning, when there were far weightier issues, like Caligula's push, to be worshipped in Judea, which nearly sparked rebellions. A pause in our narrative, a gentle intake of breath. What, then, is the truth as best we can tell? Likely, Caligula did pamper his horse extraordinarily, joked about making him consul, but never officially did. The absolute accuracy is elusive, but historians like Barrett and others lean towards it being intentional satire. They argue that the sources hostile to Caligula, writing under later emperors, had every incentive to present it as insanity rather than humor, to further discredit the Julio-Claudian line and exonerate the coup that killed him. Also, as noted, a humorous anecdote over time can lose its wink and be retold as straight fact. We also consider how propaganda after Caligula's death might have shaped the story. Claudius's regime and later ones wanted to justify the assassination of an emperor, a risky precedent, by emphasizing Caligula's monstrosity. What better evidence than he wanted to make a horse consul? Clearly he was not just bad, but mad. In the ancient world, madness was often seen as a sign of divine punishment or unfitness to rule. So exaggerating or not contextualizing such episodes served political narratives. To illustrate how accounts can differ, some less formal ancient records, like the gossip collected in the work of Aurelius Victor or the Augustan history, even suggested Caligula's insanity had physiological reasons, claiming he suffered from epileptic seizures or that he had moments of extreme insomnia wherein he'd wander the palace at night, perhaps when he visited Incitatus in the stables. While these don't directly mention the horse, they frame an image of a man not fully in control of himself. In a final note of this section, delivered almost in a scholarly murmur, we mention that archaeology and numismatics, coins, offer little to confirm the horse story. Unsurprisingly, no coins depict Incitatus or mention consuls that never were. The evidence is purely textual, thus we rely on voices from the past, mindful that they are telling a story as much as we are. Suetonius and Dio perhaps would nod in agreement with our slow, careful retelling, though they might be surprised at our sympathetic angle. For them, Caligula got his just deserts. For us, in the comfort of retrospect, it's a fascinating human drama that oscillates between farce and tragedy. Part 9. The Legacy of Incitatus. From ancient satire to modern metaphor, the lamps of history now cast their glow not on Rome itself, but on the echo that Incitatus left in culture and language. We journey forward through the ages, observing how the story of Caligula's horse has been retold, repurposed, and reimagined, always with that mix of disbelief and laughter it originally evoked. It serves as a gentle close to our long tale, seeing how a once-living horse transformed into a timeless metaphor. Not long after Caligula's demise, the episode was likely recounted in Roman schools as a cautionary tale. Roman orators and writers under later emperors, safe in the knowledge that Caligula was universally reviled, could reference it in passing to get a chuckle or drive home a point about hubris. An epigram by Martial, a first-century poet known for witty one-liners, quips about a senator so lazy or stupid that Caligula's consul horse would do a better job. We allow ourselves a tiny pun, if only in thought, on neigh, and rather the kind of wordplay Martial would appreciate. By the medieval period, knowledge of this ancient incident survived in manuscripts of Suetonius and Dio, and scholars tucked it away as one of the many strange deeds of pagan emperors. With the Renaissance revival of classical texts, however, the story re-emerged into broader awareness. European writers enamored with Roman history began drawing parallels between Caligula's horse and the foolishness of officials in their own times. One significant appearance was in the Age of Enlightenment. As mentioned earlier, a 1742 satire in London brilliantly drew on Incitatus to critique Prime Minister Robert Walpole. The satirist facetiously praised Caligula for his wisdom in appointing a horse, saying in effect that Incitatus proved to be a more honest and wise minister than Walpole. Delivered in the persona of common sense, the article slyly concluded that the horse was far superior to the man. The genteel readers of the time, versed in the classics, understood the jibe at once. It shows how Incitatus had become shorthand for political incompetence foisted on the public by a corrupt leader. The horse, ironically, becomes the hero of that satire, a model minister merely by being an unthinking animal and thus incapable of guile. The story also informed serious political thought. In 1776, as tensions flared between Britain and the American colonies, an anonymous pamphlet defending Britain's rights pointed to Incitatus as an example of the decay of Roman liberty. It essentially argued, look what happens when mob rule and tyranny take hold. You get a government by horses. The hyperbole underscores how far the Roman Republic had fallen. This use of the anecdote imparted a kind of moral. A healthy polity would never tolerate such nonsense, so if one does, it signals deep dysfunction. In a lighter vein, throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, historical fiction and stage plays about Roman times would often nod to Caligula's horse for dramatic or comedic effect. The Victorian writer Baron Edward Bulwer-Lytton included it in his novel The Last Days of Pompeii as a quick reference to imperial madness, known in the provinces. The horse pops up again in the famous 1970s BBC series I, Claudius, based on Robert Graves's novels, where actor John Hurt memorably portrays Caligula. In that dramatization, as the conversation piece we read earlier recalled, Hurt, as Caligula, dons a shining gold bikini armor and ceremoniously leads Incitatus, draped in a toga before a stunned crowd. He declares the horse a consul, reveling in the outrage it causes. That scene, while fictionalized, has become an iconic visualization, searing the image of a horse in Roman regalia into the modern viewer's mind. Meanwhile, in common speech, to call someone Caligula's horse, or to say, we might as well elect Caligula's horse, became a quip leveled at any situation where an unqualified person is promoted over others. It's a way to deride nepotism, cronyism, or the absurdity of certain political appointments. The phrase doesn't need explaining to those with a smattering of classical knowledge. It conveys, this leadership is a sham, a travesty as absurd as making a horse a consul. Even those unfamiliar with the specifics intuit the meaning, as it's often accompanied by a brief explanation of the origin. In the arts, Incitatus inspired poems and paintings. The Polish poet Zbigniew Herbert wrote a piece titled Caligula, giving voice from Incitatus's perspective, a surreal, reflective monologue of a horse thrust into power. Surrealist artist Salvador Dalí, in his 1971 series Dalí's Horses, included a piece often dubbed Caligula's Horse, depicting fantastical equine figures, perhaps a nod to the blending of reality and the absurd that the story encapsulates. In modern literature, we occasionally see reimaginings, short stories that ponder how the horse felt, or alternate histories where Caligula lived and actually inaugurated Incitatus as consul, with comedic ensuing consequences. Think of senators trying to get a law passed when the presiding consul is contentedly chewing hay. In a tone of dry amusement, we note, Incitatus has the curious distinction of being one of the few animals with a place in political science jargon. When talking about extreme cases of authoritarian caprice, scholars have references titled after him, e.g., an academic paper on political incompetence might metaphorically call a certain puppet official an Incitatus appointee. All this to say, our sleepy listener might be surprised how this ancient anecdote galloped beyond its original stables into the fields of human thought. Let's not forget the horse himself, though. Removed from context, Incitatus might as well be an imaginary creature like the winged Pegasus or Achilles' talking horses in Greek myth. He's become symbol, almost myth, but he was real, a flesh and blood racehorse, likely a splendid specimen with glossy coat and proud stride, who simply had the fortune, or misfortune, of being adored by an emperor. If there is any tenderness in this story, it might be that bond, a young man who saw in his horse a friend and a refuge from the stresses of rule. How many quiet moments did Caligula spend in those stables, brushing Incitatus's mane away from fawning courtiers and fearful subjects? Those moments aren't recorded, but they are easy to imagine and lend a touch of humanity to an otherwise bizarre tale. In this penultimate part, our narrative's rhythm is like a horse slowing to a canter. After a long run, we have traced the hoofprints through history's meadow, noting how the ground firmed the legend with each retelling. Now only one gentle hill remains ahead. To conclude, to make sense of it all, and to bid good night to Caligula and Incitatus. Part X. Conclusion. The sleep of reason. In the final hush of our story, we return to the image of the emperor and his horse in the still of night. Caligula stands in his garden by a flickering lamp, Incitatus at his side, the year 40 AD drawing to a close. Perhaps this is the eve of the new consular year, when by tradition on January 1st, new consuls would take office. Caligula is gazing at the distant stars above Rome's skyline. Does a thought cross his mind? Tomorrow, my Incitatus could have been consul. We do not know. In our gentle imagining, Caligula runs a hand along Incitatus's neck one last time before retiring to his bed. The horse huffs softly, unaware of the plots around and above him. This bedtime chronicle has woven through comedy, satire, and tragedy, and what remains is a sense of the poignancy of power misused, and the oddly innocent creature at the center of it. Incitatus neither knew nor cared about consulships and ceremonies. He cared for oats, exercise, and maybe the voice of his master. Caligula, for all his cruelty elsewhere, showed affection here, even if expressed in a twisted way. It reminds us that history often keeps a record of grand follies, while the personal, intimate truths slip away unrecorded. Was Caligula truly laughing at the Senate or seeking solace in a loyal animal's companionship, or simply too far gone in megalomania to distinguish reality from performance? Each listener may have their own answer, and history allows room for all. In Latin, Incitatus meant spur on, an apt name for a racehorse. Unwittingly, Incitatus also spurred on countless discussions about leadership and sanity. The tale endures because it sits at that intersection of hard to believe and impossible to forget. It invites a wry smile and a shake of the head. How could such a thing nearly happen? It serves as a reminder that truth can be stranger than fiction, and that those who wield great power often test the limits of the absurd. In Caligula's case, he found that limit, and it ultimately snapped back on him fatally. Now, as we close the book on this historical fable, let us do so in the spirit of its requested tone. Soothing, reflective, and a touch whimsical. We have journeyed through marble halls and racing tracks, through palace intrigue and timeless satire, all at a languid, calming pace. It is time for our characters to find rest. After Caligula's death, Rome eventually stabilized. The Senate returned to serious matters. The memory of the young tyrant was officially condemned, his statues destroyed, his name scratched from inscriptions. Incitatus fades from the record, likely taken in by imperial stables and living out his life away from the spotlight. One imagines him grazing in a quiet field as the politics of Rome carry on without him. A far simpler existence. For the listener tucked in now, the story of Caligula and Incitatus drifts off like a strange but instructive dream. The streets of ancient Rome grow silent again in our mind's ear. The laughter and gasps of Caligula's dinner guests, the cheers of the circus crowd, the murmurs in the Senate, all recede. In their place, we hear perhaps just the soft sound of a horse breathing and the faint clink of a distant wind chime in a Roman garden. Thus ends the tale of an emperor who tried to make a mockery of the world, and of a horse who trotted unwittingly into the pages of history. In the end, perhaps the most fitting moral comes ironically from a line inspired by the chaos of those times. The sleep of reason produces monsters. Yet tonight we have approached this monster of a story with reason lulled into gentle repose, seeing it through the forgiving lens of time and humor. May your own sleep be peaceful and your dreams filled with wonder. Perhaps even a parade of purple-clad horses prancing through ancient forums, reminders that even in the darkest chapters of history there is room for the absurd and the imaginative. Sleep. Well, knowing that the real Incitatus now rests too, his wild gallop long ended, remembered kindly as the horse who made the world laugh in spite of itself.